Hello, everyone. It's 9 o'clock. Shall we begin?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to share a fascinating story tonight with you. My name is Anat Ben-Shaul. And do you all hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. This Shabbat, we started reading the book of Exodus. And tonight I'm very excited to share with you a modern day story of Exodus, the Exodus of Jews from Yemen. Before I begin, I'm curious to know a little bit, what do you know about this? So how many of you are familiar with Operation Magic Carpet? Just raise your hands. Fair amount. How many of you know that it was Alaska Airlines who did this airlift? Not many. Okay, I'm so excited to be here and share it with you. So we have a very dense story, and let me tell you a little. Let's go over first what we are going to cover today. First, we'll just go briefly the origins of the Jewish community in Yemen and their connection to Israel. Then we'll get to the political reasons in the 1940s that caused the refugee crisis in Yemen. Then we will advance to the organizations and individuals who came to the rescue, and we'll close the circumstances. This is the most dramatic one, even more. The circumstances that led to Operation Magic Carpet, which is also known by the name On the Wings of Eagles, and I'll get to those two names, why. Are we good so far? Okay, a little bit about myself. So my family from both sides is from Yemen. My mother was made in Yemen, born in Israel. My dad was all through and through Yemen. Here is the youngest one of 9 surviving children. They had 3 boys who died in infancy in Yemen. And I grew up in my hometown was, did you hear about Rosh Ain? Yes. Okay, this is the capital of Yemenis of Israel. Today people hear about this in the context of it being the hometown of Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman. But I was there first. My uncle was the first mayor of our hometown, and he served in the city council until he died. I grew up with my aunts. All we lived in the same town. Beside one aunt, Sarah, lived next town, but most of them lived the same. Unfortunately, I'm left only with Aunt Sarah, Aunt Rivka, and my dad. He's the youngest. They all passed away. And I grew up with lots of stories about Yemen, but the story I'm going to share with you, I discovered it and I had no idea about it. They didn't even know about it, because sometimes when we go through events in life, we just know about our life, but we don't know the bigger picture. I discovered the bigger picture, which I'm going to share with you tonight.
Can you say what year this picture was taken?
I think it was 67, I was told. And this is my grandfather, my grandmother, the oldest sister of my dad, Shoshana, Leah, Rania, Mazal, and I'll mention some of them later, and Moshe, my other uncle. Okay, so I'm a writer, and for many years I mean, it has been a dream to write a novel about Yemen, but I was terrified. The idea of writing a novel seems to be very big to me. So over time, I wrote little things, like I wrote how my Aunt Rania almost became Queen of Yemen. And if you want, you can go to my blog, a4lifestyle.com, and read the whole story. I wrote about, on Instagram, I shared some photos. This is Genesis, book of Genesis that belonged to my grandfather. He brought it from Yemen. And I was curious to find out about this publishing house. So again, you can find it on the story on Instagram. And this is just a talit, a praying shawl, a Yemeni style. I'm not getting into this because I have a bigger story, but this is what I did. So Then my Aunt Mazal died a year ago. Tomorrow it's going to be a year. And when she died, I realized that I don't have time. If I want to do this story, I have to start doing my research while some people from Yemen are still alive and can help me. So she's my catalyst, and it's amazing that this presentation happened to be just a day before a year since she passed. So let's begin. The origins of the Jewish community in Yemen and their connection to Israel. Before we go, actually, I want to show you the map of the Middle East today, just to get familiarized with the areas that I'm going to talk to. Israel is, here is Israel, here is Yemen at the bottom. They're about 1,500 miles away, just between them. And in the 40s, when Israel was established, most of them were enemy territories. So it was tough. Just to give you, to understand the distance between Vancouver, Canada to San Diego, 1,400 miles, okay? So the origins. So it is believed, that's a story I grew up with, that the Yemeni community, also the Iraqis, are from the tribe of Judah, originally from Jerusalem, and they were exiled by the Babylonians when they destroyed the first temple in 586 BC. First, they exiled them to Babylonia, here, which is Iraq today. And then some of the families later migrated further south to Yemen. So that's what the stories that I grew up with. Whether it's true or not, there are different arguments among historians. I leave it here. Then they stayed there for many years, and the first wave of Jewish immigration from Yemen to Israel happened in 1881 and 1882. This is a neighborhood in Jerusalem in the early 1900s. The immigration from Yemen to Israel was very massive from this year, and before the state of Israel was established in 1948, 35,000 Yemenis were already in Israel, who were 40% of the community. And it was just, I don't know what happened. I'm not a historian. What happened at this time that they decided to move to Israel, but that was a trend from that time. At the same time, I don't know if you're familiar with those dates, there was the first Zionist Aliyah, immigration to Israel from Russia happened. Bilu and Chovevet Zion movement. So those two groups were very different. The Jews from Russia, they went through the pogroms, Sufot Benegev, which was around Odessa in what is now Ukraine. They were young, secular Jewish people who were fed up of being of the old type of Jewish, like their parents. They wanted to create a new type of a Jewish person, secular, work in the land, and that's why they came to Israel. While the Yemenis, there were no pogroms, something that shook their life aside from what they were used to. Sometimes there were incidents, violent incidents, but mainly they just were religious people. They did not have national aspiration like the Russian Jews. They had religious aspiration. They just wanted to go to the Holy Land and practice Judaism. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay, let's move on. So now I want to show you what happened during those years when they started to move. They were part of this is a map of the empire, Ottoman Empire in 1913, a year before World War I. And eventually we changed, that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. Both Israel and Yemen were part of the Ottoman Empire about the same years. So for Jews in Yemen, this is North Yemen. it was the same political entity to move in. So they were migrating. So relatively speaking, it was easy aside from the trip, but they were not changing going to another country. Now, another technical point that I would like to make. In this presentation, I'm going to use the word Israel, even though at this time there was no the state of Israel yet. The reason I use it because we all know this area, so it will be easier instead of confusing. And also, Jews always refer to this area, even when it was called Palestine, it's Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. So I'll stay with this name. Okay, the second part, the political reasons in the 40s that caused the refugee crisis in Yemen. Here's a map of the Middle East after World War I. So you see it changed. The parts in red are controlled by the British. The yellow were independent. The green are French. So during the World War I, the British, after that, the British received a mandate to Israel, Palestine, and Transjordan. The idea of the British to get the mandate from the League of Nations, which was the first version of the UN, was to fulfill the promise of the British government given in 1917 as the Balfour Declaration. Are you familiar with this? Okay, this is a declaration in which the British people acknowledge the right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. So they got a mandate, and the intention was to help the Jews to establish their homeland. But the Arabs who were living at the same also in the area did not like the idea, and the British got themselves into a mess because during World War I, they made conflicting promises to both sides, to the Jews and to the Arabs. So let's go. So this is a map, and if we need, we'll go back to it. So what happened here? We have the British mandate from 1918 to 48. Actually, they got officially it was 22, but they already got into Israel in 18 or 17. So through the British mandate government, the Arabs had several uprisings, but this was the biggest one between 36 to 39. It's called the Arab Revolt. And after that, the British published the third white paper, which is policies of the British government to the Palestine territory. And in this white paper, they limited the amount of how many Jews can enter Israel in the amount of 5 years. So from 39 to 44, only 75,000 Jews could enter Israel. And when the Jews heard this, of course, heard that, they felt like it was a stab in the back. And look at the year. This was the year that World War II started, and for Jews to stay in Europe, it was death sentence at that time. So it was very crucial, but unfortunately, that would happen. So, and those are the years of World War II, 39 to 45. And again, I'm going only briefly, we need to understand those international affairs to understand what happened in Yemen. So here's Yemen. This is Yemen today, and just to get the scale of the size is 204,000 square miles. To understand, Israel is only 8,000 square miles, and Washington State is 71,000 miles, okay? This is a British-controlled Aden. This is Aden here at the point here. They already got the area in 1839. The reason why, they had lots of ships going to India with merchandise, and there were pirates here, so they wanted to safeguard the pass for the boats. So they took over this part in red, which is a big chunk of Yemen, 110,000 square miles, okay? Just So we know the map. So if you can see, during the years, still the years of World War II, between the years of 43 to 44, it was a decent amount of Jews received a certificate to immigrate to Israel, 4,269. But from 42 and 48, 0. Why? What happened? And just to continue here, before I continue here, let's go back to this. So in 44, the world already knew about the genocide that happened in Europe. And the British government, when decided to give priority to Jews from Europe to enter Israel instead, and they felt that the Jews in Yemen were not in such a danger. So that's why it was 0 here. So one more thing I need to explain. Go back to Yemen. So Yemen, North Yemen was a Muslim country while the protectorate was British control. The rule in Yemen was a very closed country. You could not leave or enter the country without the permission from the imam, which was a king. The Jews had really fairly good relationship with the imam Yahya, who was during this time. There were rumors that his mother was Jewish. So, but the rule was if you leave Yemen, you cannot go back. And after World War I, they could not go within the Ottoman territory. So to go to Yemen, since it was British too, they had to go to Aden to get a certificate apply for a certificate through the British government in Aden to receive it from the British government in Israel. So once they left North Yemen to the Aden Protectorate, which that the name was called, they could not go back. So at the beginning they went and they received it, but then in 44, when the government in Israel prioritized Holocaust survivors, they were stuck. And the numbers of refugees who were stuck in Aden kept on growing. In 45, there were 1,500. In 46, 3,000. In 47, 5,000. In 48, 7,000. If you can ask, okay, what about the Jewish community in Aden? There were only 6,000. It was too much for them to take care of this problem. The organizations and individuals who came to the rescue. So the British government, they tried in the Aden Protectorate, they tried to close a border between North Yemen, but they weren't very successful. So in 44, they asked the American Jewish Joint Distribution, as we know today as JDC, to come and help. And that was a surprise to me when, as I did my research, I saw different documents. At the beginning, I didn't know where to start with looking because I knew nothing. I didn't know names. I didn't know anything. And then I got some documents that linked me to the JDC, and I contacted them, the archive. And when I received the archive, I went through their documents. I realized that they were there in 44. So in 44, they sent doctors and nurses from Israel, and they gathered them in 2 deserted military camps, Fayush and Masabain, to take care of them. So here is Dr. David Ullman and nurse Rachel Mashat. Here she is. I don't remember the name of this nurse, and I think this is one from the British government visiting the camp. So that's how they started in those 2 camps, but they didn't last. It was just to give them immediate relief aid with food, medication, what they needed, because the Jews, by the time they reached Aden, they barely had some clothes on there. You see, they're torn. When they crossed Yemen, North Yemen, it's there are tribes there, and each time they had to cross the territory of another tribe, they charged tax. So by the time they reached Aden, they had no money, nothing. So they were in dire need. Also, the weather in the Aden Protectorate was very different from North Yemen. It's very hot there, very desert hot, no grain. While in North Yemen, most of them come from a mountainous area, and my aunts tell me that it was really nice weather throughout the year. So most of them, it was really a shock to their system to move to Aden, and with no money, no place to stay. So those two camps didn't last much, and here is the map of the Aden Protectorate. So this little strip of land, this is usually where they crossed, and I think those Fayoush and Masaben were in Lahej area here, and this is in purple is Aden metro, which is about 70 square mile area. So after, there were several doctors that came for 6 months, and let's go to think about the 40s. It's not like today, like I can go work, have a project in Denver, Colorado for the week and come for the weekend. We are talking about the 40s. When they came to Aden, they stayed there for 6 months, usually, away from home, and then the JDC would find another team to send. In 46, the JDC sent another team, this time only one doctor, Dr. Gertz Beigel, Naftali Ben Baruch, that's his Hebrew name. And again, they asked Rachel Mashat to come with him, because she was in Aden in 44, but she was also Yemeni who lived in Israel, and she spoke the language, so they wanted a translator to come with him. And he is from Poland, and he studied medicine in Geneva before he moved to Israel. Dr. Beigel created, with the money that the JDC gave him, two-day clinics. So here is a map of Aden metros. This is the main one. I'm sorry for the quality. We're talking about historical maps, so it was really hard for me to find something that it would make sense. Now, for me as a writer, I needed to know the area, to know how they move, where they go. So it was on my desk as I was writing my novel.
Question?
Yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Did you say why the people were moving from Yemen to Israel? Were they being forced, or did they want to?
They just wanted, it was just a Jewish longing to the Holy Land. Yeah, that's...
So
No, nothing, no. So this is Aden. So here is Aden Crater, which was a main Jewish area, Jewish neighborhood. Here is Timber Point, which is the British government, more developed neighborhood, much nicer from what I read from the documents. Here is Hormaxor Airfield, from which all the flights to Israel eventually would take place from. And Sheikh Othman is another town outside of Aden. So Dr. Beigel first opened two clinics, one in Aden, I believe it was in Steamer Point, and one in Sheikh Othman, in which he and Nurse Rachel provided medical aid, food, money for all the refugees to help them. But then he realized he did census, and he realized by 46 there were 3,000 refugees, and they needed a place. Let's talk about the refugees' condition here. Some of them were well off, so they found a job, they had the money to rent a place, so they were fine. Some people managed to get a job within Jewish households as drivers, cooks, cleaners, so they would stay with the families that they served. But a lot of them lived in the streets or in the caves in the area. The British didn't like the people who were in the streets, but there are photos of the Jewish people would give them beds. So during the night, they would open the beds in the street, and during the day, they would lean the beds against the wall and go to get a job or find money. So he decided, he negotiated with, Dr. Bagel negotiated with the British government. He found a deserted prisoner of war camp, Italian camp, in Sheikh Ottoman that was neglected. So he convinced the British government to lease it to the JDC. And so those are just photos of Aden 15 years previous from the time I'm talking, but just so you could see, this is a government building from what I read. And this is Sheikh Ottoman, this is like the downtown. So he opened this, the condition from the British was use what the buildings you have, but anything that you want to add has to be temporary. So you see tents and hats, that's all. They wouldn't even let them have a telephone line to the camp. So it's called Khashed, that was the Arab name, but the Jewish called it Geula, salvation, but everybody knows, all the Yemenis call it Khashed. And it was a refugee camp from the March 25th, 46, when Dr. Gertz Bagel opened it, until 49. After 49, it closed down after they took all the refugees. But then more Jews from North Yemen, back then it was after Israel was independent, wanted to come. So then they reopened it, but then it was Aliyah camp, immigration camp. It wasn't refugee camp.
I'm confused.
Yes.
Well, I'm thinking people in Yemen, they weren't being persecuted, they had lives, they had homes, and they left all of that to take this dangerous journey where they had to keep paying money to each land they passed through to live in these refugee camps without clothing and medical supplies, and it doesn't make sense.
No, they did not. They were hoping, they in their, think about Yemen, they lived in Middle Ages, no electricity, no telephone, nothing. In their idea, in their mind, it's like we are going to Aden, get a certificate and go to Israel. They did not plan on getting stuck there.
But didn't word travel back over the years that
No.
people were getting stuck? That
some didn't believe. They kept on thinking to themselves, it's just going to be temporary, we'll move on, but they got stuck for several years. But the intention was not we are going to get stuck in Aden, we are going to Israel. Okay? Any more questions before I continue?
What language were they speaking?
The Yemenis, they had their own dialect, which is like Yiddish, which is German Hebrew, so it was Arabic Hebrew. And they wrote, and it's close to Aramaic a little bit. I saw some writings of my grandfather, it looked Aramaic. They used Hebrew letters when they wrote. If they were out, so usually they were isolated in their own Jewish neighborhood. If you got out of the neighborhood, you learned to speak Arabic, but between them, it was something between their own dialect of Hebrew Arabic. Okay? Any more questions? Okay, let's continue. So here is, again, Dr. Bagel. Again, there were a team only of 2 people, Dr. Bagel and Nurse Rachel. So they had to utilize the manpower that they had in the camp. The camp could only, that's really important to know, it was only made for 1,000 people. So he had to elect the most needed people to get into the camps. The rest had to stay in Aden or Sheikh Ottoman and receive the services through the clinics in the cities. There were lots of orphans, and this is an interesting story with the orphans. The law in Yemen dictates that if your father dies, you have to convert to Islam. So even if your mother is still alive, you are considered to be orphan and you belong to the king, so you have to convert, and the Muslim can do with you, decide about the rest of your life. So a lot of, when it came to girls, the Jewish community used to marry them very early, at 9 or 12, just as an insurance policy in case if the father dies, so they don't have to worry. But some boys were very adventurous, so they crossed the border to the Aden Protectorate to to avoid converting to Islam, to be converted to Islam. So there were about, I read the reports that he wrote to the JDC when he came back to Israel. He had already about 250 orphans in the camp at this time. So they trained nurses, teachers, guards, whatever they could to maintain this 1,000 people refugees. But at the same time, more people crossed the border from North Yemen to the Aden Protectorate. And the population, as I showed you before, the numbers kept on growing. Yael Ben Baruch, I said Dr. Gertz Bagel changed his name to Naftali Ben Baruch. She is a daughter-in-law. So apparently, the doctor and the nurse fell in love while they were in Aden, and they got married. They had 4 children, I believe, a son who became a doctor, she's married to him, and 3 daughters. So she wrote a young adult book about their love story in Aden. It's called Mutar Litnashek Bashvil Harashi, Kiss Me on the Main Road. Very sweet story. Just a little bit to spice up the story. So here we come, we get to December 46, the next manager of Hashed, Dr. Olga Feinberg. Before I get to the story when she reached Aden, I want to tell you about this amazing lady. She was born in Nikolaev, Russia, now it's Ukraine, in 1889. She moved to the US in, I think, 1917. During the World War I. And she was in Chicago. She was a doctor for, it was really hard to find information about her. In one place I mentioned that she was in Michael Bull Hospital. I could not find this hospital. In another source they say that she worked for the Red Cross, but she was in Chicago. And then in 26 she moved to Israel, which was a British mandate Palestine. And she visited friends, probably Arab friends, in Jericho, which is an Arab city. Now it's part of Palestine. And during her visit, their son was sick, and she realized that they had no doctor there, and she was the only doctor who nursed him to health. So she decided to stay, and she opened a sanatorium in Jericho, one of the few Jews. And she was not just a doctor, she was a diplomat. You can see here on this is from January 36, just before, a few months before the Arab revolt started. She is with King Abdallah of Jordan. There is one, I don't know which one of them is a king of Egypt during the Ottoman Empire, and there is I think this is a Palestinian lawyer sitting on the rooftop of her sanatorium. So she was very popular among the British people and Arabs and Jews, an incredible person. And I was so amazed to find out about her and so shocked that she was forgotten. When was it? When the Arab revolt started, she got warning to leave Jericho. Most of the Jewish families in Jericho fled the city, but she insisted on staying because she felt she was needed and she didn't want to neglect it. She loved the place and the people. But in 38, there were serious threats that she left just before the Arabs put on fire the sanatorium in her house. After that, she got a job as a doctor for the British military in India. So she spent the World War II years in India. And by the end of the war, in December, and there she, by the way, she was also active among the Zionist movement. Are you familiar with WITZO? WITZO? It's a Women International Zionist organization, started in England, and she opened a branch in Calcutta in India. And also, again, this woman had lots of political connections anywhere she went there, in India with the British military, with the local, Indian politicians, with the Jewish community. So on December 46, she was on her way back to Israel after completing her job as a military doctor in India. And she was asked, and I say she was asked, I don't know who asked her, if the British people or the Jewish organization, because I knew her reputation as a doctor and working with refugees. They asked her, she had a layover, 24 layover in Aden before she would continue to Israel. So somebody asked her to stop, if she could stop in Aden and visit Khashed camp to see what was going on, because they had reports that things were out of control there. So she went to, I'll still stay here. She went to visit, and she was so horrified. The doctor who managed Khashed at the time, Dr. Elkanah, his name, could not control what was going on. There were more refugees. It was not. He was probably the JDC did not send enough manpower to manage it. And again, we are talking about a population, very different mentalities than European, Western people who came. So it was not. It was very challenging. So and lots of people were sick from all kinds of diseases because of lack of water, the heat, infections. She was horrified by what was going on, and immediately telegrammed her friend, Dr. Rabbi Jude Leon Magnus. Who is familiar with this person? Okay, few. So he was one of the founders of the JDC. He's from New York. And he's one of the three founders of the Hebrew University, together with Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, and Albert Einstein. And so she telegrammed him, and she told him what was going on, and she asked him to send doctors to Aden immediately. And we are talking about the time before. During the time when Israel was preparing for its independence, a very violent time in Israel. And he told her that as a military, back then it was not IDF, it was a Haganah, was keeping all the doctors in the country because in case a war starts. So she volunteered. She said, okay, I'll stay. And he asked her how long, and she said, I'll stay as long as you need me. Well, the 24 hours layover in Aden happened to be more than 2 years. So she stayed there. She became officially the manager on February 47, but she was there from December 46. And now we are getting to the time, she was in a very crucial year in time in Aden, also to Israel. The circumstances that led to Operation Magic Carpet and On Wings of Eagles. So now let's talk before we go to what happened in Aden to what happened in the world and in Israel. November 29th, 47. The British realized that Jews and Arabs cannot share the same land, that we need to separate forces. So they created an ad hoc committee to decide how to split the country, and that was the proposition. It wasn't ideal to any side, but the orange is Palestinian, the blue is Jewish. So they submitted it to the UN committee and it passed. They voted for the partition, this resolution 181. The Arabs didn't like it. Not all the Jews liked it, like Menachem Begin, who later becomes the prime minister, did not like it. But thankfully, Ben-Gurion was a very pragmatic person. It's like, let's take it. We'll do whatever we can. So Israel immediately, within a few months, registered in the UN as a member, as a country. The Palestinians never registered themselves as a country, and that's an issue until now. So the Arab nations did not like the plan, and they declared a 3-day Arab strike all over the Arab world on December 2nd. By the way, the next day, the Independence War started on November 30th. Any questions so far? So, in Aden, it was the most violent strike. It was violent all over the Arab world, from Baghdad to Jerusalem to Egypt. But in Aden, it got out of control. 82 Jews were murdered. 30 other people were murdered. And the question is why? What happened? So my what I think is that the British people did not consider Aden Protectorate to be an Arab country. So they were sure, they actually warned all the Arab countries to protect their Jews, and they were very embarrassed at what happened to them. They just allocated a limited police force to secure Aden. But within few hours, the police reported to the government that things are out of control. The Arabs were burning Jewish cars and buildings, looting, killing, attacking Jews. So the governor declared a state of emergency and called the military to come into Aden. They had the Aden Protectorate levies. It was a force of 1,800 people who were locally Arab recruited soldiers. When they sent them in, those soldiers identified with the people who were already rioting in the streets. And together with a weapon, it became very violent issues that the government lost control. The government called force enforcement from two navy, two or several there were navy ships at the bay to come in, and they flew infantry force, a British infantry force from Egypt to come to Yemen. It took them 4 days to get control over the city. During this time, the main attack, the destruction happened in Crater, which is the largest Jewish neighborhood. They sent military to evacuate Jews from other neighborhoods to a safe place. Those Jews who refused to be evacuated were found dead later. During this attack, as I said, 30 other people were dead, soldiers among them, passerbys that were confused to be Jewish, but they were not. One was also a military doctor from India who was killed. This is the destruction later. And that happened while Olga I read her a lecture that she gave after she was back from Aden. Remember, they had no telephone they knew nothing. Thankfully, the riots didn't get to the camp, but they didn't know. But at the same time, the British military brought her trucks with 700 wounded people, and she was the only doctor there, no team. And later, by the time, before the strikes, this Aden riots, she already had 2,400 refugees in a camp that's supposed to support 1,000. After this, they had more people from Aden became refugees and people who lived. So the population in the camp rose to 5,000 people. And she was the only doctor there. So after that, I read lots of cable messages to New York and Jerusalem asking both the Jewish Agency and JDC to send more people to Aden, doctors, medications, people to help with what was going on. And the Jewish Agency sent people, Yemeni people who lived in Israel, to go to North Yemen to talk to the communities there and tell them, do not come to Aden Protectorate. Please stay where you are. When we are ready, we'll come and take you. But stay where you are. But there was a coup detat in Yemen, in North Yemen, in which the Imam, who was Imam Yahya, who was very friendly to the Jews, was assassinated. That created panic among the Jews in North Yemen, and about 2,000 people fled Yemen and went to Aden. And now we have 7,000 refugees. It was circumstances that nobody could control. In Israel and the JDC, they already knew that they needed to do to take the Jews out of Aden. And there were negotiations already in '47 with Alaska Airlines. Now let me tell you about Alaska Airlines. It was a young company with a very dynamic CEO, James Wooten. And at that time, the bigger airline companies were Pan Am and Tower Air. And after World War II, they took over all the traveling ports around the world. And he wanted to find a market niche where Alaska could get in without competing with the bigger companies. So after World War II, it was refugee moving from one country to another. The JDC approached him and he was very happy to oblige. Actually, Alaska, are you familiar with the Shanghai ghetto? Yes. Okay. So there were 20,000 Jews from Europe who escaped World War II and lived in Shanghai in China. So Alaska Airlines did the airlift to bring them to Israel just before the communists took over Shanghai. Alaska Airlines also did the airlift on Berlin. And then they were asked to do the airlift from Aden. So they started already in December '48, a few months after Israel was established. It was established in May 14, '48. And that was the first emergency. So all in all, this campaign, there were several phases to Operation Magic Carpet. And the major phases were in '50, but they continued to even '57. Alaska Airlines conducted 430 flights from Yemen to Israel and brought 50,000 Jewish people during this time. Any questions? Yes, I see.
Was someone paying Alaska Airlines?
Yeah, they paid him. No, JDC.
So they weren't doing it for
No, but they were risking their lives. They were shot. They were flying over enemy territory like Egypt, Jordan. So the pilot says that they had missiles against them, but nobody got hurt. Yes?
The airlift and the Operation Magic Carpet was happening in Aden, not in northern...
No, they all had to come to Aden, and I showed you the Home Axar Airport, the Royal Air Force Airport there in Aden. This is where they collected them.
Where was Sana'a at this point? Is it north?
In north, yeah, it's in north. Sana'a is, yes.
Was the Alaska Airlines based out of Seattle at the time? Or
yes,
so
yeah.
Moved from here there in order to do this.
Right. Yes.
Who's paying? Was it the British government that was paying?
No, the JDC, the Jewish organization.
JDC, I'm sorry.
Yeah, JDC is a relief organization. Yes.
Did Alaska advertise later on? When was it famous that Alaska helped the Jews?
So at the beginning, it was a secret. Not even people in Israel knew what was going on because they were during war. So only after they signed the peace agreement in Cyprus in '48 somewhere, it came out that Alaska was doing it. Yeah, it was reported on the news, and I'll tell you more sources about this. Any more questions? Yes.
You say the previous imam who was assassinated was friendly to the Jews.
Yes.
And who replaced him?
So for a few months, the people who killed him took over, but then his son within a few months took over and reestablished the old regime that was before. So his son continued after that, after this short period of power.
So it sounds like when he was assassinated, the people in, the Jews in Yemen were not safe anymore.
Right.
Is that correct?
They were afraid that so many, over the histories, different countries use Jews as hostages, like in Russia. And it happened in other Arab countries that it was really hard to escape those countries. So the Jews were really afraid that once there would be a different regime, they would keep them as hostages and wouldn't let them move anymore. Okay? Any more questions? Okay. So here's one book about this campaign, fascinating book. It came in 2016. Captain Elgin Long was 24 years old navigator in one of those flights. And he's still alive. He lives in Oregon. And he wrote this fascinating book. I got a lot of information from this book. And so in his book, he mentions that why it was the name Operation on Wings of Eagles was given aside from the magic carpet. They asked the Jews, the Yemeni Jews, aren't you afraid to go on the airplane? Because they never went on an airplane. And they said, no, it's already in the prophecy. So the book of Exodus and book of Isaiah, it's mentioned that. So that's why this is another name. And his team, he was on the airplane with Captain Larry Curry, and they were called the Iron Team because between March 12 to April 9, in 29 days, they did 12 back and forth trips, moved 150 passengers in airplanes that were supposed to be only for 48. They took out all the chairs and let everybody sit down on the end. Yeah. And in total, during this time, they brought 1,800 Jews to Israel. In his book, he says that when they gave their logbook to the FAA, when they came back to the US, Alaska was fine because they maxed out their hours, the limitation of how much their staff. So James Wooten didn't have a good relationship with the chairman of Alaska, so he quit. He opened a new airline company called Near East Air Transport, which was just a cover-up. It was continuation of Alaska Air and El Al. So he was just doing the management while Alaska Air and El Al did continue doing the airlift through. So that's but he was behind this, the mastermind behind this. And here is another book, came in 2017 by Dara Metzger. Here she is. Her parents, Warren and Marian, he was a pilot, she was a flight attendant, but she was a licensed pilot too. They also participated in this campaign, and they got married during this campaign in Asmara in Eritrea. Yeah. And
a moment so I could copy the author.
Oh,
Thank you.
you're welcome. If you want to know more about this campaign, the Jewish Museum in Alaska has a permanent exhibition about this.
Where in Alaska?
Alaska is a city in Anchorage, Alaska.
It used to be, in 2008, it used to be the presentation was here.
Okay.
At the museum.
So I guess I think we need a presentation here too, but here it is. And I'm very grateful for the curator and Alaska Airlines who helped me with the information. And also the JDC archive and the archive of Israel, the State of Israel, helped me a lot with lots of documents. So now, after we close this, before I give my final words, any questions? Yes?
Is there anything left of Aden Crater?
Yes.
Today?
Yeah.
A community?
There are few, not many. Most of the Jews left in 57. The British left Yemen in 57. And most of the Jews in Aden left after that. It was around after 6 Days War in Israel. It wasn't safe for them anymore. But there are few. And actually there was a wave in the 90s of Jews from Yemen who moved to Israel. Okay. Yes?
Did you find any correlation between the Mufti of Jerusalem and the uprising?
Of course, he's behind all this inciting. Haj Amin al-Husseini, he added a lot of fuel to the fire, yeah. In general, he was influential in all the Arab world. More questions? Yes?
What about your family? Do you know, was your family also stuck in Aden, and for how long?
I'll get to it, yeah. Yes.
What about how should I say, the Jews, the Yemenite Jews in Israel today? When they came, I know for a while they were culturally not absorbed into the Israel.
When they came in the 50s.
But are they now mainstream Israel?
Yeah, I mean, I have two siblings who are married to Russians. One who's married to Ashkenazi Jew. His family is originally from Russia. He was born in Portugal and raised in England. I have cousins who are married to Americans, English, so yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we are. It takes time. It's really hard. Immigration, cultural shock, and during those time, everybody was. It wasn't easy to anyone, even for people from Europe who moved to Israel. It was a hard time, but we're now 70 years later, and I hope that the Ethiopians who came in the 80s, within a few years, they're already amazing. There is an Ethiopian woman who's a pilot, Air Force pilot. There is Ethiopian officers, there are doctors. So time, you just need time, and eventually they become Israelis with their colorful origins. More questions? Okay. So before I close, I want to share with you, as I said, it was the stories that I'm sharing with you was new to me. A year before, I did not know it. So it was quite a journey, emotional journey for me, and I got so many lessons from this research. And I'll start from the micro to the macro lessons. On the personal lesson, it was great for me to connect the scattered family stories that I heard, finally to put them in the timeline of history. So I knew that my great-grandmother died in Aden, but I didn't know why. Apparently, after her husband died, her two boys decided to move to Israel, and she joined them, but she died in Aden while waiting. One boy received certificate to go to Israel before the independence. The other one got stuck there until Operation Magic Carpet. Okay? So there are many stories. I don't have time to share of them, but just one example. Doing this research changed the Yemeni Jews narrative. Growing up, I was sure that the Yemenis were very passive. They stayed there, and then Israel became independent and came to help them. When I did the research, I realized no, if it was up to them, they will walk by foot to Israel. It was just circumstances beyond them that stopped them there. So that was a very switch in my mind to see my community in a different way. National lesson discovers the power of a group. Now think about the Jewish people in the 40s. You have the Europe after the Holocaust. Israelis are fighting for their life. And you have Cyprus, you have the detainees. Yeah. Those are actually Holocaust survivors that the British wouldn't let into Israel and kept them in prison in Cyprus. We had the Shanghai Ghetto, 20,000 people who survived in China. And somehow our nation found the power to help each other. The American people, actually, they are the one who carried the heavy economical burden to finance all those movements to support the Jews in Israel during the war with food and weapon, to airlift the Jews from all over they supported the Jews in Cyprus. There were actually, from Cyprus, there were 52,000 people kept in Cyprus. Not at the same time but that, and it's almost similar to the Jews who came from Yemen, 50,000. So imagine what a greatness. I don't know how many nations can do this, focus on a higher idea, even though they're so different. They speak different languages, they have different culture, but still they found something that connects them together and work together. I think for me it was very empowering to see this. Gender. So it changed my feminist narrative. Growing up, thinking about the feminist agenda, I thought that women before the feminist revolution were just housewives. They couldn't maybe secretaries. And here, Dr. Olga Feinberg is just one. I found so many incredible women during this time, social workers, politicians, doctors, scientists. I was amazed. They made it somehow. So it made me see that women could do things if they wanted. So I saw things differently. And then let's go to the global. This research made me redefine leadership. Until then, I thought leader is a prime minister, a CEO. But going through the story, I realized that leadership is each person taking the skills and what they can to contribute to a bigger idea. So it's even the refugees in the camp who became guards and nurses. And Alaska Airlines, all their team, not just James Wooten, the CEO, they didn't have to do this, but like the Captain Curry's team who flew, they slept on the airplane because to fly from Yemen to Israel is 8 hours, to come back it was 10 hours, and they had to stop in Cyprus or Asmara or Djibouti to fuel because there was no fuel in Israel, which was going through war. So there are only 24 hours in a day. They slept on the airplane and changed shifts. He said in his book, Elgin said that only one night during this time they slept in a hotel room. So, but that was dedication, that was leadership. They chose to, they decided, they saw it was, they were saving life and they decided to do. So that was a redefining leadership, that each one of us can be a leader under any circumstances. Any questions? Yes?
They fly up the Red Sea to
Yes, through Egypt, and not those teams, but there were previous teams that flew during the war and they got shot, had missiles against them, but nothing happened. Actually, there was also no radio connection with the airport because they were under war. So sometimes they had to land just guessing things, not knowing if they are ready for them or not. You can read in those books, those are amazing stories. Yes?
Quick comment, I can't help but draw the parallel from all of that migration for a higher purpose, and I think when it comes to, following Spirit and, Holy Land especially, it's despite anything that happens, all of the trials that you go through, the hardships, that you want to go home, right? You want to.
It is a beautiful, very poetic.
Like that.
Yes,
yeah?
for them it was going home.
Now we're seeing this again in our migration stories and our refugee stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to draw that parallel and remind all of us in our leadership as well. Thank you for pointing that out in terms of like how we are supportive to migrants that are doing so for a higher purpose.
Right. Thank you.
Even if survival is the only thing.
Survival is a higher purpose.
Yes, agreed.
More questions? Okay, thank you so much.